with Peter Dunlap, or Peter T. Dunlap, as your website says, who is a clinical psychologist, also doing research and philosophy in the area of community transformation and spiritual leadership. So you're another Pacifica grad that we found. Did I miss anything or say any of that wrong?
Let's see. Well, you used some words to describe me I don't know that I would use, but I kind of like them anyhow. And did you?
Well, it's okay if other people call you a philosopher, but if you call yourself a philosopher, that's where you kind of want to, yeah, that's my rule of thumb,
I do have a degree in philosophy, and I have stuck with the practice of study. So, well, who knows? I think that'll be for other philosophers to decide. In the meantime,
it's okay for me to do it, but unless you want to, kind of have like a neck beard and some sort of strange, antiquated hat, and I don't know.
I would have had a beard.
David Tacey has a quote in one of his books where he's talking about one of the students. He's like talking about different archetypes, and he was like, he was one of those people who spoke with a strange accent, who he didn't come by honestly, and would wear red leather and robes. And when I would speak in class, he would rub his beard and like sigh deeply and earnestly. And it's just like you just have this palpable image of this person who's like, well, I'm a philosopher or a powerful magus, or whatever is going on in that guy's mind that you were in your philosophy class with in college.
I remember those type, and I was both intimidated and envious at the same time.
Yeah, there is something that's kind of enviable about that kind of confidence of just doing yourself. I mean, no shade. It's just I don't know. There was one when I was in school. There was like a guy that always like was trying to return to tradition or whatever. Of course, the traditions were not ones that he came from, and he had like thick leather pads on his. It just looked like he was dressing like an approximation of what he thought people did at Oxford in the 1700s or something. And it was kind of like a rainy day at Swanee or something. And he was like, "Oh, the good English weather." And it was like, you're from Ohio. Like,
But I'm from Northern California, other than that being harder to be any further off the beaten path with what is happening in the world today.
California is kind of its own thing.
We are kind of our own thing. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Well,
and
so
did you call me a Pacifica graduate?
Didn't you, or alumni? Did I say graduate? I'm sorry.
You may have.
I had gone through a lot of times when we're trying to find interesting people, you'll find a certain research institute or something that if somebody's a member, then their work's going to be interesting. So you're trying to find good guests. But the Pacifica alums was, I think, how I found you, or not alums, but faculty was how I found you.
Yeah,
and started to read about your work.
I'm the co-chair of the clinical psychology program at Pacifica, and we have a good time exploring a bunch of stuff, and maybe we'll get into that some just now.
Yeah, I'd love to hear about your work.
Oh, goodness. Well, mostly my work is as a clinical psychologist, where I work a lot with couples and individuals. I help young adults find their calling, and I'm really interested in the way in which we've problematically developed our thinking to the neglect of our feeling. And so I do a whole lot of work helping people become rational by reconnecting to feeling. That feeling, our rationality is dependent on really having access to a normal range of feeling. That's one of the things that makes us able to, move around in the world and not bump into things too badly.
Yeah, a lot of times when I am working with supervision candidates or doing a consultation group, you've got therapists that somebody says something that, clearly, is the voice of an inner critic or, an oppressive voice in society or something that's not theirs, but they're doubling down on some position that's unhealthy. And the nature of the more cognitive therapist is to get into a debate club with them. And it's like, no, that feeling's not coming from their brain. It's coming from their heart. If you just push that into their body and make them sit with that for a few minutes, they're going to realize that they don't believe that and then it feels icky. If you debate them, then they're even more cut off from their body. They're even more dug in. You'll never get it. Just take people at face value that they believe what they believe, even when you know that isn't really healthy or not what they believe. And if you can push them into the psyche soma, their body will tell them something that you're not going to get to through their ears and their brain.
I like that strategy. There's some faith that it's really possible to have in each person and to help their best self come forward with just some kind, loving, very, very direct.
Yeah, and so you do the clinical psychology program there, which specifically is one of the, I mean, I think one of the last, depth psychology, only universities around. It's an interesting place. And then you also have some other work you've done outside of that. Do you mind talking about any of the works that you do with kind of politics, transformation, creativity, community?
Well, I come from a political family, and my dad was a very committed liberal progressive back in the 60s and 70s.
I saw your George McGovern button and 60s headband. That was pretty cool. The picture of you in braces.
Well,
you still got it?
Yeah, I think this is a different one than in the picture you're referencing.
Okay, yeah.
In my junior high school, I started a George McGovern for President club and got in a little bit of trouble for it from the principal. But he was rather friendly, and he knew my family and my dad, and he let me off the hook. But he said, because you started the George McGovern for President club, some mother is knocking on my door, and she wants to start the John Birch for President club. And that was a different time back in 72. But since then, I've just really seen the way we liberals and progressives have really not known how to bend the narrative of our time.
Mm-hmm.
And we've had a lot of success, but right now we've had so much failure since Reagan, that since his narrative about everybody for themselves has taken over. And we live in desperate times in need of some larger narrative. A year ago, President Obama asked us, what common story could we tell that would hold us all together and move us to the future? And I think that's the work of depth psychologists, is to learn how to tell the stories that would hold us together.
Well, historically, that part of the alchemical process of letting go, dissolving something to get to that isn't working anymore, to get to the true, gold inside, is not something that works very well politically, especially in America. I mean, crisis of confidence speech is, what thought of as the biggest failure, politically. And it's really just Carter being like, hey, I don't know if our mythology works anymore. Maybe it does, but could we all sit and wonder if we need a new myth? And no, man, we won't. Stop. Stop making me feel stuff.
When you sit and wait for a new myth, I think what happens is people get afraid because they don't want to hang out in between stories. And so that's when authoritarianism becomes welcomed. We welcome the aggressive, male-dominated type of authoritarianism that really controls people from the outside. And so in order to let some new myth arise, we actually have to remember the value of caring for one another and putting each other first. And that comes with a level of sacrifice and duty that none of us quite know how to do well enough right now. And I think that's on all of us.
Well, and I think you're saying it causes anxiety to have to wait for the new myth. You're also telling people that, what they identified with in the past is not right, which can be a huge opportunity for growth. It's hard to tell that to a patient in a room. You have to creep around that for several sessions and maybe use a metaphor or a story or, in order to make that something that the psyche can tolerate, that isn't threatening and overwhelming and re-traumatizing, but the person can see it as an opportunity for growth. I don't know how you do that with 8 million people. I barely know how to do that with one person in a therapy room.
See, this is where groups become so very important and interesting, because there are social change organizations that are working on this every day, all day long. There are hundreds and thousands and tens of thousands of really good people working on this from the left and the right. There's an organization called Braver Angels that has chapters around the country that sit people who are left-leaning and people who are right-leaning down at the same table and help them learn to talk to one another. And I think there's an opportunity for psychotherapists to get more involved, such that storytelling that we do know how to help one person at a time tell becomes more accessible in larger group contexts. And I think that's part of the vision, the original vision of psychology by our founders. They really wanted to see psychology become the narrative used, the means used in every institution, whether they be political or religious or humanitarian, that by sitting down and talking to one another and finding our shared humanity, it really becomes possible to bridge the differences. But it's going to take something at a more organized level, given the level of polarization that's dominating us now.
Well, but what you just said is that you want people wanting to see psychology become kind of the future. And outside of somebody that, has a very literal belief in some sort of religious practice or something they'd like to see society centered around, I think most people would agree with you on what that is. Where most people would fight is when you start to say what psychology is, because on an individual level, psychology is the class that I had to sit through where they said, all right, id, ego, but that's outdated. Jung, collective unconscious, if you get him at all. And then here's the behaviorists, and then here's the cognitive therapy. And it's not that threatening of a concept, but when you get to a society level and you start talking about psychology, you're talking about who I am and how I think, which is not something that most people want to know, or they would fight kind of with you about how people work and what the nature is, especially when you're of humanity is, especially when you're right. And so you get, you're talking about Reagan and Thatcher coming in and that kind of period of austerity and, disbanding community resources to focus more on kind of, national, personal freedom and national mythology, essentially. But one of the things that did is it pushed psychotherapy incredibly cognitive in a way that it still has not recovered from. Because
I think you're right.
I mean, and for two reasons, I think. I mean, one, it was just appealing to that myth to say what I think is all that I am. There's nothing else to me. I really am the simple. The line needs to go up. I need to have a bigger army. I need to have a bigger bank account. We are all just what we do, not what we feel. And so hierarchical thinking and, that's a very cognitive construct. But then also you just had an explosion of corporations that kind of started to corporatize academia and healthcare in a way that those entities have not recovered from. And cognitive therapy is very useful. If my insurance company is going to say you got 6 sessions to cure PTSD or else you need to just take medicine, cognitive therapy is great there because there's not insight and growth and these bigger things that are harder to turn into a number. I don't know. I'd be interested in what you think.
Yeah, well, you're working on several things at once, and let me see if I can help us untangle them. Certainly, cognitive behavioral therapy has its place. There's a process going on over the course of the 20th century that we could describe as the democratization of access to psychotherapy that was once only available or to the really rich, is now becoming increasingly available to more people. So be it. The bad news is cognitive behavioral therapy really narrows down what it means to be human problematically from what I can tell. Now, somebody sitting here from a cognitive behavioral perspective, they and I would have an argument about that, and that's fine. It's good to have open debate about that.
Well, some of them, they say they're doing CBT, but when you talk to them about what they're doing, it becomes very clearly that they've just realized how to use the CBT framework language to turn into relational therapy or to turn into psychodynamic therapy or even more of a Jungian, self-discovered process. When you listen to what they're actually doing in the room, it isn't what Beck says to do in the CBT book.
That's what the evidence-based therapy is starting to uncover, that what we're learning from science, what we're learning from the research into psychotherapy is that it is two human beings sitting together, reestablishing the primary attachment links that make growth and being open to learning possible. And it's all based on relationship. Now, what does that imply out there in the political? I think what it implies is some need to go very slowly and not to imagine that we're going to suddenly get people that are extremely different from us to the table. I don't think we need to create one big tent that everybody's comfortable in. I think that we need to rebuild things a little more slowly than that, and each one of us will do that differently. You're doing it in the way by holding these podcasts. I do it by working with people on the political left who really are the ones holding my community together. They're the ones out there finding candidates to run for the city council and raising money and putting up yard signs. And so I like to sit down with them and find out, how they're doing, what level of distress they're experiencing. Are they lonely? What would happen if they got attention from each other and not only held meetings that were based on who's going to put the yard signs up next week, but really paid attention to each other in a creative and more psychologically focused manner. And in that way, psychology is not just psychotherapy. Whether you go behavioral or cognitive development or emotion focused or psychodynamic, all of those are psychology, but psychology is much bigger than psychotherapy. It's much bigger.
Yeah.
It has to do with how we treat one another, and that we can learn to apply psychology in our social change organizations to make them more of a home, to make them a place where people can go to experience belonging and connection, and to have that become the center of activity that enables us to strengthen our social change organizations and bring about more accelerated change. Specifically around climate change, I think that is the primary crisis that's driving all of the other horrors of our time.
And I think one of the ironies with climate change is that we evolved to understand fairly simple systems. I mean, some of the smartest people can understand kind of maybe 5 layers of cause and effect in a complex system. Most people see 1 or 2. I felt bad when I was in that store. Well, you got a phone call that was bad. No, I'm just going to go ahead and associate that whole thing with feeling not good. We don't really want to interrogate those systems and pick them apart. It was evolutionarily beneficial for us to not have. I mean, we weren't supposed to be supercomputers modeling incredibly complicated, global phenomenon. They're just kind of supposed to be like, red berry tastes good, green berry makes you die. don't do that. That was, and now we're sitting with something that is so infinitely complicated. By the time everybody can readily apparently see the problem, it maybe is too late.
Well, it is too late. Now, we don't know how bad it'll get. We don't know how far the environment will deteriorate. We don't know what level of social organization we will maintain. Let's cross our fingers and hope we really do have a chance. But what you're saying is really important, and we don't need suddenly people to handle much greater complexity. We need a story that holds all people together. We need a story that holds people together regardless of how much complexity they are comfortable with. A good story that's true. The story has to be true. It can't go around blaming other people for things they didn't do.
Sophistry feels good, Peter. What are you trying to tell me here?
Well, we want a story that creates space for everybody to belong.
But I'm good and they're bad, so you're kind of making me feel not special.
It's okay if you really need to blame people. I'll say, you must be really mad. Tell me more.
Yeah.
People need to be
now
listened.
You're doing therapy.
Well, sure. Well, I think good storytelling does that.
Yeah.
People used to sit around the campfire or in their village centers, and they used to dance and sing in their churches. They would listen to the minister. And they would all have a place where they had a deep experience that they belonged to that group, and it would be resonant and filled with feeling. And that's something that we can recreate through the right type of community leadership that has some training in psychological awareness.
Well, that's why I was wondering what you'd think of those Adam Curtis movies. I don't know if you got a chance to look at him, but I mean, what I've seen in my lifetime, and I mean, I don't go back to the 70s, I'm born in 87, but what I've seen is, and it kind of switches. I mean, the left and the right go through a period of, kind of being more populist, but there's in America, what I've been forced to pick between in every election is a group of people that's telling a story that is compelling and interesting, but also a lie that isn't helpful and a misdiagnosis of the problem, usually scapegoating a group of people. And then you
Yep.
have another party that is refusing to tell any story at all. Like they're telling me to go to a website and memorize facts, or this is just right, or you should do it. And it's like, please stop. Like, and
Well,
I mean,
so
that's what you want to sit these people down and be like, look, the thing they teach you the first day of law school is that it doesn't matter what's true. What is relevant is, can you tell a story that the jury, it makes sense to them? And so, you know, when I'm in college and there's all this, the beginning of, you know, you start to hook, you know, basically old people into email for the first time, you know, and Obama's getting to be president, and there's these interesting, you know, artifacts coming out of that. But it's like, you know, when I'm sitting there and I'm, you know, 89, and I, you know, the Rural Electrification Act brought a light to my house or whatever, and somebody says, well, Obama's a Muslim hologram. That's a compelling story to me. Okay. We need another one too.
I don't think, I'm not interested in upsetting people. If that's the story someone needs to believe, then God bless them. Really, truly. There are enough, we only need to tell a story that brings a few people closer together. It won't take many. We need to tell a story.
That's it. It's going to be a patchwork, like a quilt. It's going to be a community of small communities, not a giant community.
Yes,
you know?
It's not a big tent. We don't need a big tent. We're never going to get a big tent. What we need is to bring enough people from the near right together with enough people from the near left, together with enough far lefties with medium lefties. Wherever the breach is within the left, progressives and liberals, whatever the breach is between the moderates, whatever, there's a current breach inside the Republican Party that's profound. It's just profound, the breach within the Republican Party. And a part of me could say, you know, go ahead, you guys fight it out. I'm going to sit in the sidelines. But I really think that would be a mistake on my part. That breach within the Republican Party is a breach inside me. And there's some intense emotional pull toward the deepest form of closing boundaries around small groups because of how scared and angry those people are. And that should be respected and considered.
Well, I think they're scared and angry on, you know, kind of the liberal middle left too. It's just they're scared and angry of a different thing.
I agree.
I mean, I think the appeal of, I mean, I don't really think I don't know. I mean, I think the appeal of like Fox News is that, like, you know, your cultural star is not waning. It's not that like you're aging and your perspective is less relevant. It's not that the world has changed since you were 13. It's just that the world is bad. Everyone's bad and you're good. So just get really angry about this, and this becomes this kind of addictive thing. Whereas it seems like CNN, what they're saying is like, oh, look, you know, you don't need to change anything. You don't need to do anything different, you know, other than maybe vote. But like just know that you're correct. You have the right opinion. You're looking down on the right people. And while you're looking down on the right people, you're on the right side of history, and you're not going to be embarrassed, and you're not going to look foolish. And that's kind of the itch that scratches.
So we know that systems close boundaries using stories. And we know that hate feels good, and the purpose of hate is to close boundaries around identity groups. We know all of that. So those of us that are trying to create something post-ideological, that's where psychology comes in. Psychology is something that takes place in the clinic or the posh private practice office. That's a psychology. But psychology also applies where any narrowing of the truth can be addressed. And my focus is, I want to address the narrowing of the truth that takes place within the political left. That's where I have placed the lever to move the world. I want the political left to have more tolerance for the truth. And
that would be nice.
We on the left are not that good at the truth. We're not that good at science. We make all sorts of silly claims about how we're the ones that are devoted to science. And we are only really interested in the science we can cherry pick right off the low-hanging fruit that already aligns with the ways we think. And what we need is a triple down commitment to a full range of science. And it will be very humbling because of the reasons you're listing around the way we tell ourselves stories that are arrogant.
Where does that aversion to it's not even aversion. It's like this ambivalent relationship that the kind of moderate, middle left seems to have with science now, where it's like, I mean, they had I don't know if it was a campaign or something. It was a bumper sticker where everybody had this "I effing love science" things, and you follow their LinkedIn or their Facebook profile just a little bit, and when they're done posting about Harry Potter and Star Wars, they're yelling at somebody who posted a research study because it doesn't agree with their worldview.
Well, we live in really troubled times, and so it's so tempting to find fault. And
well, I love science does not mean I watched Neil deGrasse Tyson one time. That's not what that means.
I know, but here's the thing. What you said earlier about levels of complexity really applies here. That when I'm having a bad day, I'm going to be not as open to all of the complexities of what's true around me. One of them's going to get under my skin, and I'm going to want to snap at my neighbor, or I'm going to want to drive too fast on the freeway and be pissed at somebody cutting me off, or I'm going to be a little bored by one of my clients instead of kind, patient, and empathic and direct. So I have real bad days, and mostly I have pretty good days. And on the good days, then I don't get surprised by how hard it is to stay open to the full complexities of what's going on around us. Someone like Rachel Maddow, who I assume still does television broadcasting, though I stopped watching her years ago.
I haven't had cable ever, so I'm not really sure what the lineup looks like now. They seem to get canceled every other year now, so you got to refresh it.
Whether it be her or a dozen others, there's just a way of cherry picking the facts and coming up with pretty pat arguments, and then displaying contempt for anybody that doesn't go along with that storyline. And I don't think people should indulge in contempt right now. It's way too risky.
Well, but I mean, serious question that's a little bit... Go ahead. I'm sorry, there's a delay. No. I didn't mean to interrupt you at all. Please finish.
Oh, that's okay. All I was saying was we need more humility.
Yeah.
And there's nothing harder.
Well, there's two questions that I've got there. One is a little bit more theoretical, and then one's a little bit more practical. One, are you familiar with John Beebe, the Beebe model of the MBTI?
John was on my dissertation committee.
Oh yeah.
And I've published a review of his book. And at first, I didn't really get the MBI, the Myers-Briggs, and I was kind of polite to John because of how much he had helped me. And then he caught on that I was only being polite, and he nudged me and he said, "Well, Peter, it's about consciousness." And I go, "Oh," because he knew I was interested in consciousness. So I started reading closely and studying, and I started catching on. It works. It's an excellent system for understanding why I lean this way and you lean that way, how we're different.
Well, the Beebe model of the MBTI specifically tells you that you can use that individual psychology that is studying inside of you to see how you're going to project that externally. And I think that because you can turn individual psychology or group psychology into a cosmology, basically, that seems very useful for being able to understand society. Because like, for example, in the Beebe model, like I'm kind of a EI split, I can split between EI and FJ, but every time I've ever taken it, very strong NFJ, INFJ, ENFJ, split, but 100% of my points are in intuition. I'm just very bad at doing anything that's kind of detail oriented or rote memorization hierarchical. I'll try and figure out how it works and, whatever. So it's like that gets me in trouble, but that's what happens is, I want to sit with the gray area of everything and look at these sides and whatever, but my shadow type is going to be the opposite of that. So when I'm in crisis, like when I'm starting the clinic and I'm working 17 hours a day and, stuff's going wrong at home and stuff's going wrong at work, and I just don't have any more bandwidth, then I become extremely black and white and extremely, judging, thinking, and it's the opposite of my personality. But I think societies function the same way, I mean, there's a reason that you have kind of a right hierarchical snapback at the end of every kind of introspective point in history. The 80s come after the 70s for a reason, I think.
I think that's right. And here's a way to open it up historically and measure it in terms of hundreds of years. We have the Enlightenment that differentiates thinking and sensory experience, and that leads to the scientific and industrial revolutions. Maybe that's a blessing, maybe it's a horror, depending on who you ask and when. Certainly it's both. But then what ends up happening is people become so lopsided with thinking and sensing that they lose the moral bearing of feeling, and they don't object to colonialism or raping native peoples or killing native peoples. When Napoleon goes into Egypt in 1798, I think, and he gets a bunch of prisoners, the prisoners have dark skin and they're Egyptians. And normally what he'd do is he would repatriate prisoners if they were Austrian and white, but instead he mows them down, he butchers them. And so this is a underdeveloped moral function that is haunting us moderns. And so us in depth psychology are trying to do something about that one person at a time in the clinic. And we have 30 years now into emotion-focused therapy and relational therapy and really using feeling in a creative and powerful way. And in that way, we're working for the whole Western civilization, trying to rebalance its lopsided intellect. Now, as soon as you get into the political world, the left becomes utterly blind and indulges in that thinking analysis that you described earlier as going to facts and not telling stories. And so one of the things I do is I really try to help people on the political left use the therapy they've been in for their private lives and bring that into their public way of engaging with one another, so that we reconstitute feeling as a a higher form of intelligence that we use socially. Now that's something that need to do to rebalance the typological imbalance that's been taking place for hundreds of years. And it's possible to do, and a depth psychologist can lead the way.
Well, and I mean, the second part of that practical question when you're talking about the news is like, in a system, can a system that is pretending to be objective because they put the two people that disagree about this thing in the room on either side of the screen and they fight, even though, well, actually there's these other truths all over here. And you just pick these two people that have one difference to pretend that the truth is on, 2 inches to the left or right of the middle. But like when you have that system and you're taking and every corporation has because, we used to say you work for the people if you're on the news. The government pays for the news hour and you're not able to go pick a side and work for a corporation. You have to be objective. If you say something that's a lie, you get in trouble. And then Reagan chips away at those because he kind of wants to tell some stories about Iran-Contra and stuff. And then Clinton completely says, you can actually own the news station. Just go ahead and buy it. So, you've got corporations that there's this whole cycle, and you have the same general who's the 4-star general in the military who now is sitting on the board of the Lockheed Martin company or, whatever military contractor that goes on the news to say, well, they won't let us, we need to cut loose. We need these bigger bombs. Look at this product. Look what it can do, basically to do advertising for a government contractor. And that's, there's a million different examples of that, but you have this kind of feedback loop of these companies that own an interest in each other pretending that they're a news company when they're really not. Is there a way to do what you're saying at all under that system? Is the answer just to turn it off and have a conversation with your church or your school or your employees instead of listening to this stuff?
I like that idea. The scale that corporations now dominate, the way that the media and government and corporate private for-profit corporations, the way those three things are fused together is disastrous.
Well, it can't change its mission. I guess what I'm getting at is it cannot change its mission away from profit. You can make a really good point to it. You can have really good people in the organization. You can basically like they're going to expand within the limits of what you let them do within regulation, but they can't. I mean, I was remember as a kid there was like I think it was Nike, but there was like some big protest that happened on the lawn of the CEO about how they were making all of these shoes for 10 cents an hour and child labor, whatever. And the CEO came out to the protesters and he was like, I agree with you. I don't want to do this. But if I do what you're saying, they'll fire me and they'll put another person there. I'm irrelevant. I'm a cog in this process. What you need to do is make it illegal. Because if you don't make it illegal, the next guy will just come in here and do it. And if I do the right thing, I'll get fired.
In order to make it illegal, there are hundreds of people working every day, maybe thousands, on what it takes to have ethical corporate organizations.
Mhm.
And those people make slight improvements. I think we're living at a time where we've lost more ground than we've gained ground, but those things are hard to measure. And I would turn to the experts who are working on this, such as John Harrington, who has worked on ethical corporate investing with investments. And I would ask him, are we making any headway? In the meantime, what I'm interested in is being able to bring about the political leadership who could really create the pressure on those larger institutional forms to make them more empathic toward all of humanity, because corporations should really serve the human species and the ecosystem to make them just, sustainable, such that human beings get enough food to eat, that they have education, that they have a place in society where they belong, where there is ethical work for them to do. And these progressive values of mine are in the descent right now, way too much. I'm going to assert my ideological values and help the political left win more elections by getting the heck out of its head and into its heart, and learning how to lead with feeling and story. So we learn how to create enough cohesiveness on the left to win enough elections to get the political right to sit back down at the table to negotiate democracy's future, rather than continuing to tear democracy apart. If we don't learn how to tell good, true stories, if we don't know,
Or
learn
just
how to tell
stories at
good,
all. I haven't seen a story from the Democratic Party for a long time. I mean, but I think there is a tension between people who see themselves as kind of responsible or moderate or the adults in the room on the left and the people who can tell a story. I mean, there's almost a mistrust of somebody who can intuitively read the room and connect with a group of people from, the central, what the Democratic Party is, which goes back to the 60s. I mean, it goes back to Vietnam and the Chicago 7 and a lot of those guys. And I'm not trying to say that I'm not picking anybody. This is a psychology point about their campaign. It's not a political one. I'm not really publicly forward with my politics, but I mean, Obama basically used a lot of kind of empty things without committing to specific stuff, but then when I watched Clinton's campaign, like she would get up and there was no story. It was like she would negotiate with herself. She would be like, well, somebody said we should do this, but also that's too far. So what if whatever? And it's like, this is a campaign rally. And a lot of what you were told was, we'll go to the website and read the data on the page about the proposed bill, which is not a narrative. It's not a story at all.
I agree, and I'm working to do something about that. I'll be teaching a class next Friday to graduate students of depth psychology, and the story I'll be telling is of the history of humanity and the way we have evolved successfully, and our failures of evolution, Western civilization's successes and its failures, and how that leads us to this moment.
Mm-hmm.
And what are the opportunities of this moment? And the fact that we have the left, whether it be Obama or Biden or the Clintons or Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders, or dozens of other people who are successfully holding our democracy together, but they are problematically one-sided in terms of their intellect, and they don't quite know how to embody the feeling level and the intuition level to create the stories, really does create a place at the table for the depth psychologist to step forward and into the role of helping. Now, Ariana Huffington in 2010 said, enough analysis. We need more to hear from more of the political pundit Carl Jung. Now, if that wasn't somebody pulling a chair out for us at the seat of cultural leadership, I don't know what was. The dilemma is I'm part of the international Jungian community, and as much as there are a few dozen of us trying to step into that seat, we don't quite know how to come out of our psychological story enough to get those people, the politicos, to show up at our conferences. We depth psychologists are really ready to do therapy with the world, but the world has not shown up for its first session. And that's on us depth psychologists for not getting out into social change organizations and talking to the politicos doing the trench work where they are. That's on us.
Well, I mean, and kind of when I was asking about that failure to tell a story, and just some of the like examples I've seen of that is like, don't you think that there is an inferiority complex beneath living in your head that much? That there's a fear of being, well, I won't look serious, or I won't look smart, or I won't look presidential, or I like if I show any intuition, if I show any authenticity, if I even say what I believe in a way that isn't, put the word salad, then I'm going to get in trouble.
Let's do something about that. So back about 25 years ago,
do you think that that's wrong? I mean, I'm what I'm asking about is a generation that's kind of older than me. I mean, it's like, those. Do you see that trend, especially in the kind of liberal left, of I have to?
There's a reason for it, and we can do something about it. So let's do something about it. 25 years ago, I did some research, and I got a bunch of folks that are activists and leaders from the political left, and I sat them down and we talked about it. And one of the things that came out is this prejudice against feeling. And one woman who was on the city council at the time spoke in the research circle about the way that she had been attacked at a public meeting, and she had to go in the back room to cry because she couldn't dare show feeling in public. Well, I learned that 25 years ago, and since then I've been helping community leaders and psychotherapists to reflect on that reality and to begin the work of doing something about it through training. We can train ourselves up. There are tens of thousands of good therapists around the country, maybe 100,000, maybe 1 million, I don't know. And all of them could help community leaders develop their emotional intelligence and learn how to use it in public. I call that the development of a very simple public emotional intelligence. And once the left catches on to this, they will win more elections.
Yeah.
And there are some politicos who are starting to do this more, but it's really hard. People who are more right identified identify with different values than those of us who are left leaning, and the values they identify with are solid, important, good values. And those of us that are more liberal, the values we emphasize are different. And we serve a purpose, and people on the right serve a purpose. And in a healthy democracy, the tension between the right and the left leads to good things. Now, our polarization has deteriorated the democratic process to the point where we are at risk for losing our democracy. And those of us on the left, I think we need to stop putting the right down in our overly simplified manner.
Yeah.
And those of us on the left really do, as you've said, need to learn how to tell effective stories that really are motivating and moving. And there are some people on the left who are better at that than others.
Well, and I think that Freud called it the narcissism of petty differences. But what you have a ton on the left is people fighting about semantics, about language, about aesthetics. And I don't like people fighting about aesthetics at all. I mean, there was just an 8-year period where people were yelling like, well, I think the president should have bad manners. I think the president should have good manners. And I was like, I care about how many people are starving. I care about how much healthcare exists. I care about what our planet looks like. I care about how much money is going to this and not that. I don't really care if he's reading Emily Post or not.
That was
But that's
well
just
said.
me.
I really like how you put that.
Well, I think it's an inevitable process if you take away all the levers of power and you say, okay, well, it's too far to do this because that alienates this part of the Big Tent Democratic Party. Well, it's too far to do that because that's not reasonable anymore. We have corporate control. It's not the 70s. So there's no power that you have. What's left other than the way things look and the way they sound? Because as there's less and less things that we're allowed to expect the president to do or the party to do, then there's less and less.
Political correctness is what is killing the left. And the division into smaller and smaller identity groups, Freud's narcissism of small differences, is a result of not having a shared story that catalyzes our movement toward engaging the political right in a way that brings everybody back to the table to negotiate our shared future. We need a story that is about the human species' shared future on Earth that accounts for where we will be in 7 generations, the fact that species are dying off, the fact that glaciers are falling into the ocean, the fact that some of our children aren't going to have children because they don't think it's ethical to bring children into the world right now. We got to have a story that accounts for all of that. I happen to think the origin of that story needs to be on the political left, going post-ideological and really expanding its psychological range to stop demonizing, to withdraw its projections, and to cohere a more potent center on the left. But that's because that's where I want to do my work. I'm sure there's equally important work to do on the right.
Well, and I'm not trying to punch left or right. I mean, what I'm saying, I think more broadly is related to that, is that I think that change begins at the local level. And that if you have healthier local communities and you begin to faster have a network of those communities, and we try and change all this stuff from the top down, like, whoever's in charge of the whole system or the president's going to come in and change it. And they do have some power, but I think that if you're going to make real progress in the direction that you're talking about, to do that without a community of just, somebody online posting about it, without any friends, without a church, without a secular organization, without, a work community, without any kind of local community is something that just doesn't work. And we have forgotten that as we become more digital, really.
I agree with you. One of the things that is happening in my community, 2 friends of mine, John Crowley and Lou, I always have a hard time with his last name, and so now I'm embarrassed. But anyhow, Lou and John hold something called Petaluma Conversations at the local library, and they show up with a handful of lay trainers, and they put a political issue on a card and set that card on a table. And then people from the community show up. They've been doing this for years. And they pick which table they want to sit at. And at each table, there's a trainer. And they take turns talking. And when one person talks for 2 or 3 minutes, the next person reflects what they heard before they say their piece. It's profound.
The inner telephone game.
Yeah, well, it's profound.
Yeah.
So I don't get to stand up and say my opinions until I've demonstrated that I listened really closely to the last person who spoke.
It's pretty brilliant.
It's brilliant. It truly is. Lou is also helping he helped start the local Braver Angels organization chapter, and they bring red and blue citizens together and step them through highly psychologically disciplined practices of how to listen and how to communicate across the red-blue difference. And bless his heart for doing that. I don't think I have the stomach for that. And John is also part of a organization called Petaluma Tomorrow. Cool Petaluma, that got $1 million grant to help Petaluma lower its carbon footprint. And they're going neighborhood by neighborhood and training volunteers in every neighborhood as to how to talk to their neighbor about what practices will lower each neighborhood's carbon footprint. And they're using, neither John nor Lou are psychotherapists. Lou's a trained mediator, and John's background is in computer engineering. And they have trained themselves in reflective listening practices, and they're bringing those into their social change organizations. This, if there is a future, this is one of the ways it will unfold. Through those of us with psychological training, getting more active in our communities and helping our communities develop the tolerance, the patience, and the humility that they need to work out these differences. And it is possible, and it is happening.
Right, and there was a guy who used to do in like the early 2000s all of this. Like I'm blanking on the name because he was a like an activist and kind of a political artist, but he would go to these communities, these small towns, and talk about like climate change and nuclear weapons and the amount of risk and the amount of money, and he would kind of get shouted down. And so then he quit doing it and he would go back to the same towns, and he thought the people would kind of recognize him, and they didn't. And he would do a different project and be like, okay, look, this town has $4 million that it just gets, this county. What do you do with it? Every year you get $4 million. And they're like, oh, build a school, we'll do this, whatever. And he would come back and be like, okay, that's great, but you already spent it. You can't build a school every year. What are you going to do with the $4 million next year? And they're like, well, I mean, we could do roads. And he's like, okay, that's infrastructure. So that's gone too. You've already done it. You don't need to do that for another 20 years. What do you do with the $4 million? And then they would start being like, what is this money coming from? And he's like, well, we have the nuclear capacity to blow up the world 30 times. But even if we need to, we really just need to blow it up once. So like, if you just got rid of the ability to blow up the world, 29 redundant times, you just have all this extra money. So anyway, what would you spend it with? And then they get angry and they're like, what? Why do we do? We could have $4 million. Like, and then the people were like yelling at him. And I think that kind of appeal to community and the direct effect of this stuff, which is why I think when you start saying, values disconnected from the material, that's where they're dangerous. Something like that is making such a direct connection, to the heartstrings and not the our ego values.
Well, I like the idea. Of, appealing to the pocketbook, obviously, but also just having communities reflect on what their needs are, and seeing that the way we currently are organized and the values that we're currently organized by are hangovers from a past time. So whether in psychotherapy you had to help somebody to have insights about how their childhood affects their current life and their current relationships, or if you help a community do the same, these things are possible, and it can free up energy, or it can free up money, or both.
Well, and you're having somebody immediately participate in a vision of how the world could be better without telling them that, and which seems condescending, or there's reaction to it. Here, they're just envisioning, what if I had $4 million? What does that look like for my kids? What does that look like for the road? What does that look like for whatever? Whereas, because they're feeling it. And I think one of the places where you get the most pushback left and right is if you just say, hey, what if the other side's not that terrible? What if the other side's solution is not that terrible? It's just that neither one is really that great. What if we could just slightly believe in a better possible world? Such a negative reaction to that. They're like, why are you letting the Democrats off the hook? Why are you letting the Republicans off the hook? You must secretly be working for them, or you must not know this list of terrible facts I found on Facebook. And it's like, no, I'm just saying, like, maybe there's a slightly better way to do things, and Americans have an immediate angry negative reaction to that.
Hold on. I don't think that's true enough to follow. Some people do react that way. So your statement is true, but it's also a caricature. And I find as a caricature, it goes too far. Because it's also true that I find when I talk to people that if I'm patient, and I don't have to be patient that long, but when I'm patient, people are willing to de-escalate conversations. People are willing to talk more about where they're coming from emotionally. And that gives me a great deal of hope that people want to find the best in each other when they are attended to effectively. And so what I do is I train community leaders and budding therapists how to use the psychotherapy skills that work so well to create healing from psychopathological suffering, but also work to create the type of relationships we need in our communities. And I have a great deal of faith in that. That when people are listened to, they stop pointing fingers at others.
Well, and I'm not, I'm not saying that I have no faith or respect for humanity. I mean, a lot of what I'm talking about is an increasingly large, maybe it's a minority, but it's increasingly getting larger group of very politically reactive Americans that are very emotional and very upset. And those people are going to be incredibly important if you're going to build the project you're talking about. And so kind of what I'm thinking about is how do you reach them,
Well, I'll tell you, I think I know. When there's polarization, you want to tell everybody within arm's reach. Only the people that are within your arm's reach. Don't try to imagine a single story for everybody. But those people you can reach, whether it's this podcast, in your neighborhood, in your clinic, or wherever, those people you can reach out to, help them see that it's normal to polarize. It's normal to close boundaries when you're distressed, and help them shift the conversation to talk in a new way about their own distress.
Well, I think one of the ways, go ahead.
It works.
Well, I mean, the way that I've found to do that, which I mean, I guess is going to be people that are, my age and younger, is by being a little bit, having a little bit of a sense of humor, maybe being a slightly self-deprecating about my politics, other people's politics, kind of the silliness of that, which is sort of what I'm trying to do. And sitting with that, people withdraw the projection, they withdraw the projection of the shadow over here and the grandiose, wonderful savior, daddy, mommy over here. And so I'm not, and I think some of that, especially when you're dealing with younger generations, I mean, I'm not trying to make fun of it, what anybody thinks, or make them feel bad. Just saying, like, I don't know, we get really upset and turn blue in the face and yell and we cry about it and whatever. It's kind of stupid. Like, can we just have a little bit of a sense of humor, have some humor about how we think in order to feel a little bit less important,
Joel, I'm with you, and I'm curious about how we wind this conversation up. What would, because at this point I need to go have some breakfast.
No, we really, really appreciate your time. It's been fascinating talking to you, and anything that you kind of want to close on or promote, I'll definitely throw in the show notes of the show. And we just, I don't know, it's really neat to kind of have two different sets of language or two different ideological lenses and see how those come together. So I always appreciate conversations like this one.
Well, I think, just in closing, I think the work is to learn how to use a psychological perspective or a psychological attitude in a more expansive way to really be able to account for the social and the political, but not to do it solely in the name of critiquing the failures of any ideology. Those of us that have psychological and political training are responsible for articulating a means to an end. We're responsible for identifying the social and political problems and the mental health issues linked to them that are currently haunting us, and doing more than criticize. We're actually responsible for developing a remedy, for developing a shared practice that can take place in the clinic or the private practice office, or the classroom, or the city council chamber, or the dining room table, or in the national news media, or between nations. We're responsible for articulating a story that is able to be told readily and somewhat easily in all of those places about our shared humanity, and about now is the time to bring ourselves back together through sacrifice and some experience of shared duty and humility for the sake of what's happening in the world, for the sake of pulling ourselves back from the brink to give us a little breathing room and to buy us some time so that we can really see the extent to which there are solutions to our problem, And they begin with the right, effective psychological story that is about all of us and all working together.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for your time, Peter. That's beautiful.